There's a lot going on this week. They just passed the tax bill. We're just days away now from the deadline of the initial pause in the Liberation Day tariffs. The bond vigilantes returned in the UK this week. What do you think, Luke? What sounds the most interesting to you?
Let's talk about the bill. Actually, I think you looked into a bit as to like what that's going to do, and a lot of all I see, I go on X occasionally, and definitely Musk's tweets are like the top one up there, and he's really screaming and yelling for like a new party and stuff. So it must be really bad. So let's start there.
Musk is really not happy. It made me think a lot.
Let's get him behind a third party, though. I'm all for that. That would be fun. You can really test his political clout and capital if he could successfully start a third party. That'd be.
I think that he already did test his political clout and capital, and we saw it didn't go that far.
All right. Well, he'll retake the test.
But I think he's just much better suited getting us to Mars and, doing more interesting stuff. Brain implants and super intelligence. Like, who wants to be working on tax bills when you're doing that instead?
I mean, he would respond that and say, we can't get to Mars if the U.S. collapses under debt. That's what he would say, I think.
Yeah, no, he probably would say that. And yeah,
if civilization collapses behind, a debt wall of 40 trillion, 50 trillion, then there's no going to Mars.
So that's a good question. In the context of Dalio that we talked about and the tax bill, so much focus on the deficit, what would happen? Like, what would it take for society to collapse, like you just said? Like we talked with Dalio, it's basically whenever people stop supporting it, more or less. Whenever people stop buying the debt, it spirals out of control, and you just have to take the hit. But I guess my point is that every other developed area of the world is basically just as much in debt. Some places more so in debt, some places a little less in debt. It's almost like you need to look at these debt levels on like a relative basis. And that's kind of the feeling I got from watching some of the interviews throughout this week as some of the members of Trump's group talked about the bill, and they were very adamant that this thing's going to decrease the deficit.
Yeah, but they have to say that. Did they convince you?
I mean, they have to say that, but in response to some of the criticism about the deficit rising so much, like one of the other things that Bessent kind of touched on was that he kind of highlighted the point. It's like, well, we're getting started here. We're trying to move it in the right direction, and this is a good first step, is kind of how he characterized it. It's kind of like you can't just totally turn everything around in one fell swoop. You have to like very gently kind of nudge it in the more right direction. Is this nudging it that way? It's tough to argue that if you take that CBO estimate, 3.4 trillion at face value, doesn't quite seem like it. But a lot of their arguments are on the economic growth point. The CBO has this long-term economic growth projection, and the big criticism that a lot of these guys give is that their scoring system, their models don't take into account positive impacts on economic growth that result from the bill. They take what the long-run estimate was at the beginning of this year, basically, the coming from the Biden years, and they just project that forward. I think it's like 1.8 or 1.9% or something like that. The more I listen to Kevin Hasset speak, he really seems like a pretty intense econ nerd. And to me, he's kind of earning a little more clout, kind of the more that I hear him speak. He's definitely not in the mainstream. He supports Trump, he supports his policies, but he's definitely a very thoughtful guy. And in fact, he's like one of the contenders for Fed chair coming up as well. So I think he's definitely someone to keep an eye on. That said, we can go ahead and
personally. You feel like he's getting more clout? You mean that to you personally?
Oh, just me personally. Like
just you personally.
Yeah, like I just don't know anything about him really. Just now seeing a few of his interviews and how he speaks and, what his reasoning is.
CBO says that the Senate bill increases the deficit by $3.3 trillion from 2025 to 2034, and that is $1 trillion more than the House bill. There were already concerns about the deficit in this bill. Do you disagree with those numbers?
Oh, I 100% disagree with those numbers. You remember that in the House bill, there were a bunch of things that were temporary. that were there for the first 4 or 5 years, but then look like they raised money in the out years. But of course, a big tax hike in the fifth year is going to cause a recession and reduce growth and increase the deficit. The number that I think is the best number to think about when you're looking at that 3.3 trillion is that if we get 3% growth instead of 1.8% growth out of this bill, then that adds 4 trillion to revenue, which means that this thing is a big deficit reducer. This is the biggest spending cut in history, the biggest tax cut in history, and with a little bit of growth, it's going to be incredibly positive for the budget. And finally, don't forget, this isn't the only bite of the apple, that we've got lots of discretionary spending that we're planning to send up to the Senate to rescind. Russ Vogt, the OMB director, suggests that maybe that's going to amount to about 160 billion this year. If you get the 160 billion of rescissions, then multiply that by 10 to think about what the deficit impact is. So this is a very fiscally responsible bill.
So it does rely, though, on the economy moving up to 3% growth. Why are you confident that this bill does that when, I mean, it is mostly an extension of the taxes?
Well, there are a heck of a lot of, first of all, you have to compare it to what's the baseline, right? So if we have the biggest tax hike in history and we go back to not expensing capital machinery and so on, then what is that growth effect? That's a really big negative. And then there's all this new stuff that's very, very growth positive. So, for example, no tax on overtime. We've got about 90 million American workers that are hourly workers. When they don't have to pay tax on their overtime, then they're likely to work harder. That increases supply, puts more money in their pockets. The Council of Economic Advisors has modeled all these things and says that income for the typical American family is going to go up by $10,000. So that's real income. So this is a very, very growth positive, income positive bill.
The biggest thing that the biggest thing that stood out to me was, if you really believe this, that Voigt number with the rescissions. So he really thinks it's going to be 150 billion or something, 160
I think he said
billion
160 billion
a year.
Yeah, well, that's like how these CBO things score.
It's not a CBO thing. They're saying that.
Well, no, I mean that's the general methodology that the CBO follows. So everyone kind of uses the same thing. Like you make an estimate for this year and, you just draw a line forward 10 years into the future. Like they made a similar estimate for tariffs, for example. This didn't get a lot of coverage, but they estimated that the tariff income over the same period is going to increase by $2.8 trillion. But they didn't include that in the cost of the bill for some reason. So they said that, they got 2.8 trillion, something like 280 billion per year multiplied by 10. I think it's pretty common for people to kind of, take these current year, this is going to happen when we take this action, and it's just going to, go 10 years on. At least that's obviously what he did there.
Anyone, so many people cite these CBO things, and I remember we did a thing where we just don't believe them at all. How much weight do you put into these numbers at all?
Honestly, not that much.
Honestly, the only number that he said that kind of got me interested was that rescission number, because that's one I don't think that would be. There's no reason that would be.
Because those are spending cuts.
Those are hardcore rescissions. That's slice. That would be, of all this, that would be the one thing I personally am most interested in.
That's real fiscal restraint.
If Voigt can get half of that a year, but we'll see. I mean, that's kind of the number that Doge has hit already, right? If they kind of take it. Is that, you think, what he's citing? Not Voigt, but Doge?
What was the last official Doge number?
I don't know. I think the last one that we quoted was 160 or something, kind of at Musk's send-off. I guess there are a couple nuances there. It's not clear if that 160 billion is a year or over the 10 years. For whatever reason, budget cuts and deficits and all like that are all quoted over 10 years, which is stupid, actually, now that we kind of think about it. That's pretty dumb. And that's why that CBO thing is so incredibly easy to game, because who the hell knows what's going to happen, let alone, tomorrow, let alone a year or 10 years from now. It's stupid. So it should just be one budget. That's what you should be talking about. One budget at a time. So I don't know what they're quoting.
Can we decrease it a little bit each year? That seems like that would be easier to do rather than dealing with these 10-year estimate numbers where you've got 3.3 trillion quoted, but he said here, if the input to the model was 3% GDP growth instead of 1.8%, then he said it would be deficit reducing. Apparently 1.2% added GDP increases more than would decrease the deficit by more than 3.3 trillion. Incredibly sensitive to one of those inputs, and it's so highly uncertain what these inputs are. It does seem pretty silly to project those things over such a long period of time. And it's funny because both sides of the aisle, they kind of just pick and choose the parts of it that supports their argument.
Yeah,
so obviously those that are against it, look, it's cost this much. Those that are for it, they've got flawed assumptions. This is silly. Look at our spending cuts we're making.
Now that you mention it, we are so many conditionals deep that this is almost like a meaningless discussion, which I think is sort of the point of, I think that's where politicians would exactly like it to go. Never mind, we're talking, like you said, like sensitive inputs and stuff and projections and CBO stuff, and it's super politicized, and it's just what ifs that we're not even talking about anything real, which I think is exactly, we're just playing again into the hand of politicians. It's just pure talk now. You can't even get concrete.
Like at the end of the day, isn't that what politics is?
Yeah, but that's not us, Joe.
Well, we're talking
we get
about
down to the real. We get down to the root
of that evil.
Yeah. If history is any lesson here, I mean, you could take the kind of the must route and just say like, nothing's going to change. It's just, doesn't matter what party's in there. It's just the cash cow. All you can kind of have is more leverage in getting money to your personal projects in Congress, if you're on one side or the other.
I guess to take the other side is that this bill does make material spending cuts as well. And nearly all of the deficit increases come from these extensive tax cuts. So you are rewarding people that are paying taxes, that are being productive members of the economy, versus removing some social assistance, in material size. So if you're giving more capital to people that are using and putting that capital to work and taking it away from people that presumably are not working and contributing, that's the whole point of one of the things on Medicaid. They're adding more work requirements for those that are like no health conditions, able-bodied. But I guess what I'm saying is, I guess the spirit's kind of there that like, let's cut back spending, just pure discretionary spending, and we'll take the hit by lost revenue instead. Because like we keep saying, we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. So there's some effort there, in my view, to attack that spending problem side.
Be interesting to see like what the worst offenders were. But yeah, I mean, we can look at that PAYGO report or the CBO thing, but it's pretty silly. Right. Cool. Yeah, perfect. This is what we should be doing. Yeah, exactly. Cool. This is pretty good. All right, so this is kind of what all the news agencies have been quoting recently, but I think you mentioned that there might have been an updated one, which we can't find, but this is still pretty fresh. Just a couple of weeks ago.
But yeah, this is the official page here. This is where the 3.3 comes from.
2025. So they're saying spending outlays minus is bad, right?
That's reduction in spending. So that's deficit positive.
Okay, got it.
So on net, the deficit's going to decrease this year. So we start off strong, deficit reducing, and then it all falls apart in the first 5-year period, but not quite as bad then in the second 5-year period.
It's subtracting its direct spending outlays minus revenues.
It's saying over the 2025 fiscal year, this bill will reduce government outlays 197, but it's going to be offset by 96 from lost revenue from tax cuts.
Okay, cool. So in the top line, we're all for that. We like the fact that direct spending outlets, to your point earlier, just saying that like, okay, direct spending is going down. This bill is bringing down, but the real killer is the revenue decrease. So honestly, I am sympathetic to the idea that, look, the revenue number projection is, I think, much more of a question mark. And really that goes back to that graph that just kind of shows like after a big tax increase or decrease, it's really not indicative of like where revenues are going to go as a percent of GDP, I think. The direct spending to me feels a lot more direct.
Yeah. So like there are actual programs that are getting canceled, and presumably they're not going to come back.
All right, let's get into details. What's this table 1?
Estimated revenues, non-interest outlays, and net interest costs. Lost revenues 25 to 29, saying minus 2.129 trillion.
Oh, that's nice. Net interest costs, and there's a little asterisk. On June 18, 2025, CBO revised this table to correct spreadsheet errors. I hope it wasn't like, yeah, they put minuses where like pluses are supposed to be, because it's just like, I don't know what, like, I got to look at it and I'm kind of like guessing, like, okay, so I guess row 1 minus the second row, and then put a positive sign on top of that. Like, what the is going on with these tables? So it's like they take that minus the 373, and then they take the absolute value, and they plus it, and that's the increase in the primary deficit. Okay, revenues 35 plus non-interest outlays. I guess I will say there's a certain advantage to making like these tables almost impenetrable, because then you just are kind of at the mercy of whoever's explaining it to you. And if they can do it confident enough, you just got to be like, oh, okay. Because it's just like addition and subtraction. But like, yeah, clearly you could see it's 161, because we're getting it from 199 and 35. You kind of got to look around and be like, oh, yeah, I mean, I see those numbers. And you can just talk your way out of a meeting. You just talk them to death. As a regulator, we see that all the time. They'll just talk. You have it for an hour. Just be like, yeah, look, so the dynamic, you'll see that kind of at the bottom half of the screen, the dynamic estimates under the House Rule 88. That's really important, because then it's going to be a negative number, but really we're looking at the positive one. That's going to be at the bottom. That's like the deficit number. And so you'll see that the increase, and they'll just go, and you're just too polite to be like, that's enough. Like there's a congenial meeting, but then they're just filling it with fluff. Nothing. I remember taking note. Okay, so you want a little side story. I got to a point where like I was taking notes, and I'm like waiting to take something substantial, and I just never wrote anything. And then I would look back on like the notes I took for that meeting, and it would just be blank. I'd be like, what did we just talk about? We didn't talk about anything. So I got to a point where I was just writing like everything, because like otherwise it's just, there's nothing there. At least you can go back and say, okay, this is anyway. All right. But look, dynamic estimate, budgetary feedback for macroeconomic effects. I don't know. Do we know what House Rule 88 is? Or I'm sorry, 13.8. Net interest cost income changes interest rates in the baseline projection of federal debt by longstanding convention. Estimates under House Rule 13.8 do not include any increase or decrease in interest payments on the federal debt that would arise from an estimated change in borrowing needs. Okay, there you go. So they just say we're going to draw a straight line for on interest rates. A B looks like it's something. So it includes a dynamic estimate under House Rule 13.8 plus increases in interest payments on the federal debt that would arise from the estimated net increases in borrowing needs. Okay, I think maybe I see what's going on. So like there are 3 sections here. So there's the conventional estimate, and then on the first thing, what they do is they don't try to change what's going to happen with interest rates, and then they try to do that on the second line, on the dynamic estimate under House Rule.
Yeah, it's really unclear with that.
I take that back, because otherwise the net interest cost should move. They're both 199 and 242. So maybe I don't know. What are we doing, Joe?
So we do have 8 more pages.
Let's just dive into one of these. I mean, how HR1 would affect the economy.
So it says GDP would increase by an average of 0.5% over the 10-year period. Interest rate on 10-year Treasury would go up by an average of 14 basis points, and inflation would rise by a small amount.
Really? That's the extent of the effect of the economy? It's not bad. Saying real GDP is going to increase. And what do they mean? By an average? So that's every year? 0.5? That seems like a lot. Seems to be giving them a lot of credit there. How they went ahead and like tried to predict interest rates is pretty crazy. Interest rate on 10-year Treasury would go by an average of 14 basis points. How'd they get there? That is wild. They had no idea. Totally meaningless. Inflation would increase by a small amount.
Also, yeah, what does that mean? For 5 years, small amount.
And that's it. There's got to be like a huge body of work behind this.
But at the end of the day, it's so assumption dependent, no matter how much work you do.
I mean, it's crazy. No way. Yeah. Here it is. They're gonna talk about right here how it would affect real GDP. Let's go.
0.5% on average over the 10-year period relative to the January 25 projections. Effect would be positive in all years, peaking in 2026 at 0.9%.
Well, I think I see what they're saying. They really do mean like they would increase real GDP growth? Or no, I guess they do mean, I mean on average.
Yeah, I guess they have a baseline level per
I see.
year in GDP. And then that number times 1.005.
I see what they're saying. Yeah. Over that 10-year period. So
Each
it's not
year,
every year. It's just over that 10-year period. And they're just drawing a straight line. That's what they mean by on average. But I think what they're saying is like, okay, say in 2025, it's like 100, just call it GDP's at 100. And they're saying that by 2034, it's going to be 110. Okay. Sounds like a 10% increase. I think what they're saying is that GDP growth would increase by 0.5% over that 10-year period. So it wouldn't be 110, it would be 110.5. That's it. That's tiny. And so and the only reason I think that it's like they'll, the effect would be positive in all years. So in CBO's assessment, average annual real GDP growth would be 0.09 percentage points higher for those years, and then those percentage points higher over the entire years. So this is important because I remember getting on them about using percent versus percentage points. So maybe they say they don't mean real GDP, they mean real GDP growth. No, it's got to be real GDP. And then I
think it's an increase in the real GDP level. It's not.
I hope someone who's watching this, who like wrote this, is just either laughing or crying, watching us try to figure this out. Because either it's like this is so obvious to them or whoever's watching, and we're just stupid looking at this, be like 9%, so like 2,006, or they're just crying. Because like I like to think I'm somewhat educated. Like this shouldn't be this hard. This really shouldn't be this hard, Joe. Average annual real GDP growth. That's like the most clear sentence I've gotten so far. So in CBO's assessment, average annual real GDP growth would be these number of percentage points higher. That's like annual real GDP growth, this many percentage points higher. Clear. So it's the sentence before that that's throwing me off.
Yeah, that's strange. I don't understand the second sentence, that 0.9%.
I don't understand the second sentence. Because with the first sentence and the third sentence, I think I understand. It's the second sentence that's throwing me off. All right. Jesus Christ. Okay, we're getting through this. What's the next? So, it's 8 o'clock. All right, that's it. Another episode of the Root of All Evil podcast. Showed you a table we couldn't really figure out, and we got a paragraph we couldn't really understand. Come here for all of your in-depth economic analysis. The provision of the bill would affect real GDP in the short and longer run through four main channels: aggregate demand, supply of labor, changes in capital stock, changes in total factor of productivity. They kind of sent us the link to that huge model, so maybe there's more data there. But what's the next thing? I really want to see the interest rate section real quick. Oh, they're going to talk it here. Interest rates. Oh, great. This is going to be gold. CBO estimates that HR 1 would increase interest rates on 10-year Treasury notes by an average of 14 basis points relative to their 2025 projections, increase aggregate demand, employment, and modest upward pressure on inflation. So I guess they're referring to what they talked about earlier. So they don't mean aggregate demand in terms of like financial assets. They just mean in general.
Yeah. Like real,
CBO expects that monetary policy officials would slow the decline of their target for the federal funds rate in response to these. Increasing it relative to the January projections. So they're saying the monetary policy officials would slow the decline of their target. So they're just saying, like, if it's going to be a boon to the economy, they're not going to lower interest rates as quickly. Hence, the interest rates are going to go higher. So really, their analysis, at least according to this simple paragraph, is not so much trying to figure out like the demand and supply of treasuries, but it's really like what's the overall effect on the economy, and then how are the Fed officials going to respond? Which is like a pretty
logically, yeah, that makes sense.
Yes, that is one form of analysis. That is one level of analysis. Interesting that they would go that route as opposed to like, all the other billion things that go into interest rates. Let's see what else they say though. In the longer run, the bill would increase government borrowing rates relative to CBO's projections through two channels. Okay. Greater federal borrowing, push up interest rates. All right. So now okay, right. So this is coming into so they already, I guess, talked about the economy is going to be doing well, hence higher interest rates. That's the Fed side of the analysis. Now they're going to the financial, debt supply demand side, which is what I thought was kind of more interesting. So they're saying higher supply, which would push up interest rates. Second, the bill would increase the supply of labor relatively more than increase the size of the capital stock. The resulting reduction in the amount of capital per worker. That's interesting. That's not a interesting connection there. I'm not too familiar with that.
Increased labor supply relatively more than the capital stock. So that's saying more people are going to come into work, which that makes sense because the Medicaid things, they're adding work requirements. But the capital stock does not see a similar increase. So if you got the same capital, more workers, you got less per worker, but that would increase interest rates.
Yeah, they'll have to draw me a line there.
Yeah, I really don't see the connection. Inflation, here we go.
Let's talk inflation, and then I gotta bounce.
It would cause inflation, as measured by the CPI, to be slightly higher than the 25 projection, even with the tighter monetary policy noted above. It would peak in 27. Estimates it would increase the inflation rate by 0.12 percentage points in that year. CBO estimates the bill would not affect inflation after 2030. So even with higher interest rates.
Discussion on inflation.
Yeah, I mean,
sure, okay.
Directionally, where how do you even?
Okay, fine. There's so little here for us to comment on.
Yeah, they don't even say where it comes from, and why would the tighter monetary policy not bring about? But considering that your result is higher inflation, increased revenues from higher real output. Okay, so this is like the economic growth effect, that modest GDP increase. So you get plus 124 billion over a 10-year period.
Okay, could you scroll up real quick? What are we on, page 7? Go back to that table that we were really struggling with, page 2. And what did they just say? 170. Go back down to let's go check out interest rates, inflation. Rates, okay, that's really it.
Oh,
estimate interest rates accounted for how monetary authority. Okay, man. Yeah, this is nothing. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Once again, underline that really these numbers don't really mean anything. All right. I think that's how we end it. You came with this journey of a lot of furrowed eyebrows as to where this stuff comes from. And in my personal, as I go through life and I sort of make little adjustments to the world around me, I'm just going to further discount the CBO estimate stuff. It's just, there's nothing there.
The cynicism increases. The
cynicism has increased. Yes. Over the hour or so that we've been doing, recording this thing. It's just like, cynicism's up. All right. Well, thanks. That's it.
I mean, we definitely, I feel like I have a better idea of what those numbers mean.
Nothing.
I guess, we'll just have to wait and see what the effects are. So we'll check back here in 2034, Luke, and check on the GDP level.
Got to do some back testing, absolutely, on these models. I would love to see what sort of back testing they have done. All right. Anyway, I'm Luke. Those are the Root of All Evil podcast.
I'm Joe. Thanks for joining us here, going through this difficult journey.
Jesus. Yeah. All right. See you next time.
All right.
Bye.